Now, when you have such thought-provoking speeches, it's a shame not to explore it further, so that is exactly what we're going to do now. We have a panel about inclusive culture, and it's not with the speakers that we just heard from. We actually have another panel, so I'm going to introduce them and ask them to make their way up on stage. They are Neil Basu, who's retired Assistant Commissioner. Welcome, Neil. Also, Abby Johnson, Chair, Independent Scrutiny Oversight Board. We are hoping we have Professor Mark Fenton-Creevy from the Open University. If he hasn't, he has? Great. Welcome, Professor. Come on up, please. That's lovely to have you with us. We also have Tracy Betts, who's the Chair, Disability Police Association. Welcome, Tracy. And we have Chief Constable Vanessa Jardine, who's the NPCC LGBTQ+ lead. So let's give them all a round of applause, please. That's our panel. I'm brandishing my iPad because I know you're going to have lots of questions, so if you do want to take part in the discussion, please submit those questions now and they'll come through to me and we'll put them to our panel members. But before we do that, I just want to start the conversation. And let's start with you, Tracy, if that's all right. You're smiling at me. I promise it's not a difficult one, but it's a very pertinent one given what we've just heard already. What is the biggest challenge for disabled and neurodivergent people in progressing their careers? What would you say?
Thanks, Amina. Excuse me. First of all, it's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me. There are so many. There are so many. We have processes that aren't really fit for purpose. Not one size doesn't fit all. Listening to our staff, we've already heard from the speakers before about the importance of listening. So for people with diverse abilities, so that's either neurodivergent or disabilities, often when we're looking at things like reasonable adjustments, our default is to say no, and then we have to justify and rationalise yes. Let's have a radical change. Maybe our default could be yes, and we have to rationalise why we've said no. And something very simple like that could make an enormous change in looking at our processes around how we recruit and develop our staff. So very simply, just understanding what inclusion by design means, getting the voices heard early, looking at equality impact assessments, and looking at our processes.
Okay, and from what you're saying there, not being asked to justify why perhaps there was the initial response.
I beg your pardon, sorry?
And from what you were saying, not being asked to justify the initial response you gave when you said you say no, but then you then have to justify and explain that.
I think that just to clarify that point, very often when we're asked about a reasonable adjustment or a workplace adjustment, it is very easy to say no because we don't have to rationalise, we don't have to record why we've said no. It's often a default tick box. No, right. We have. If we turn it the other way round and our default is yes, but we have to rationalise why we're saying no, then we'll have a very different outcome. That's what I mean. Okay,
great, thank you. Neil, obviously we said you recently retired, or you have retired, but I just wondered, when you reflect on your time in policing, what do you think the service can do now to address the cultural issues, in particular of trust and confidence, because that's a big issue for policing. Certainly we've heard a lot about it in the headlines this year. But how would you see that panning out, really, internally and externally?
I mean, that's a huge question, and I could give you a lot of sort of managerial answers on how you improve trust and confidence, all the things about procedural fairness and being more visible and more connected to communities and bringing back neighbourhood policing. But I think policing's got a massive problem, and you've just heard it very eloquently described by everyone with a protected characteristic. We are stuck. I was a very young sergeant on the Lawrence inquiry back in '99, and I speak about race because as a 55-year-old mixed race man, I know more about the prejudice around race than anything else from personal experience. But I don't just talk about that, I talk about prejudice. And from those 5 colleagues who were talking about the problem with protected characteristics, there's a deeper malaise in policing, which I think I would ascribe to a bullying culture. It comes from a very strong command and control culture, a military-style institution founded 200 years ago, very hierarchical, very based on I know best, do as I say, not as I do. And we have a whole generation of leaders, the worst of which are bullies, who basically treat people that they should be told what to do and they should be inspired through fear and not respect. And when I have met those leaders in my time, they all have one thing in common, and it isn't racism or misogyny or homophobic. I tend to meet people like that, they tend to have the full set, as I describe it. Their bigotry is about putting people in their place. And what they see as a sign of difference is a sign of weakness to them. And so they will use that against that person. And I've seen an awful lot of that in my career. And if you want to correct the malaise that policing is in, I think what Mark Rowley is doing in the Met, I commend him for that. We talked about it a lot before he applied for the job. I would have done exactly the same thing had I gone for Commissioner. The thin end of the wedge is people who are overtly prejudiced, and you have to get them out of the organisation. But actually, that's a very tiny part of the problem. The deeper problem is the culture that allows bullying to go on year after year after year. And how do you deal with that? And the fact that we see a lot of it underground these days is, when you speak to people my age, and Paul, wherever Paul's gone, I sort of sympathise because I have 55 years, I'm in my 56th, I'm now late 50s. When you hear people like me speak, we can sound very much like we are victims of something that happened to us. Because if you were born in the 60s and raised in the 70s and coming of age in the 80s, I've got hundreds of experiences of brutal racism I could share with this audience. And people of my age do. And what surprised me after George Floyd was how many young people still have those experiences as well. It isn't just old people like me. And it is the same for all 16 organisations have asked me to speak. Only 6 of them were connected to policing, which I find slightly sad. But the reality is everybody in the room who has a protected characteristic, or a number of them, if you want to talk about intersectionality, are busy nodding at all of those experiences because they recognise what it's like. So curing that culture of bullying is the most important thing. And I'll finish with this, is the most powerful people in policing, Home Secretary, College of Policing, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, National Police Chiefs Council, and you've got Mark coming tomorrow. Mark is a close friend of mine, but the Commissioner. So maybe those 5 institutions, if they don't care about this subject, why should you? And I'm retired because I didn't feel they cared about this subject.
You see, that's a shame, though, isn't it? Because people will say, well, if you felt you had to retire and that you didn't want to stay and perhaps change that culture, which I know you have done in your time. I'm not saying you haven't.
Only tried it for 30 years.
Yeah, exactly. And I do understand what you're saying in terms of the age range as well. I'm the same, so I do completely understand what you're saying. But I just feel, when are we going to change the culture? When is that going to happen, and how? Can it happen? Or are you saying, get rid of all those bullies, and from what you're saying, that would take out quite a lot of senior management, wouldn't it? Or senior level policing?
It might do, but not as... I'm very fortunate I spent 30 years in policing because I know a great deal about policing and a great deal about police officers. So when people ask me, wouldn't you do it all again, boss? My answer to that is yes, if I was 25, not 55. But my answer to that is yes, because I know what the average calibre of police officer and policing is. And generally, chief constables can't say it anymore because they sound offensive, but it is incredibly high. On their best days, they are the best of the best in society. I know that, so I would happily join them again. But there are a strata which is incredibly problematic, and you have to do something about that. And yes, I feel psychologically very badly compromised by leaving before I could do anything about it. But the reality is I was never going to get another job in policing when this current political climate is in. Now, I'm not a chief constable anymore, so I don't need to be apolitical. But when you have got, and you can ask Yvette Cooper, because she will have a view on this that will coincide with the views of everyone you've just heard. That is not our current Home Secretary. If she becomes the Home Secretary and says that, or quite a sad response to that will be chief constables who said one thing today, who reversed their position in 18 months' time. Even though that will be much more aligned to my thinking, there's also, you need to question whether that is right or wrong. You know, speak up for your values now, not just because they are politically aligned. And I think the politics of the culture war and the anti-woke and some of the things some of my senior colleagues have said is absolutely disgraceful and ought to be taken out.
And we will ask Yvette, I promise, when she's here. She's here tonight. I just want to ask Abby a question now, but I appreciate we've got a slight problem with our questions coming through. So if you do have questions, could you please put your hands up and we'll get them roving mics to you and we'll do that. So any questions, please put your hands up. And while you're doing that, I'll just put a question to Abby because the ISOB report, it is critical of the progress made against police, race action plan. Why has progress been so slow?
I think it goes back to what everybody has said. What I found interesting in the questions that you were putting to people was that you were asking them to kind of prioritise a single issue, but it's not a single issue, it's a structural and systemic one. And the point that we're making in the report that we put out, where we're reviewing the progress of the Race Action Plan, is to highlight that the fundamental problem with the Race Action Plan is it's meant to be an anti-racist programme that is built on a structure that mirrors the structure of policing. So the very structure of policing is intrinsically discriminatory. You have a hierarchical structure, you have an admission in terms of the reason for the programme existing, that black and other minority ethnic officers and staff are under-promoted, under-retained, undervalued within the service, but you've introduced a structure which reflects that to try to highlight the talent that ought to be making decisions within the Race Action Programme. And if you look at the resourcing behind the programme, it's not funded by the Home Office, it's not inspected against by HMIC FRS, it doesn't have the uniform backing from the chief constables that the initial rhetoric in June 2020 seemed to signal. There's a lot of time that has been spent, for example, having discussions or debates about terminology like institutional racism, which I witnessed, Neil witnessed, and others have, where what struck me at one point was the arguments or the back and forth wasn't about the existence of racism, it was what type of racism existed in policing. So it was actually essentially centred around the comfort of the language by those chief officers. There was one point where people were talking about, well, maybe we shouldn't call it institutional, what if we call it systemic? Or maybe it's about timing. If we say it but the NHS hasn't said it, why should policing be the first to admit institutional racism? And I sat there watching this room of people who were predominantly white, predominantly male, having a debate about an issue that directly affects the lives, well-being and progress of people who do not look anything like them. And so I think that's an issue within the programme. And the way that manifests is the individuals who are very, very dedicated to the progress within the programme, many of whom are in that structure, are therefore not resourced in the way that they need to, they're not supported in the way that they need to, those who do support them are not as vocal as they ought to be, and the system allows for that to permeate and allows that to continue. So I think there needs to be a structural difference in the delivery for the Race Action Programme for it to be successful. Happily, what I've seen is through the fresh leadership that's been brought into policing, we've got Alison Hadari now, who is the Programme Director for the programme. We have Gavin Stevens, who's the new chair of the MPCC. There's, I think, new kind of energy, that's a new focus that's being brought into it. The MBPA is being brought more closely aligned with the programme, who are a key assisting organisation for delivery. But it's still working in a silo. It's still a race action programme that is a form of discrimination that needs to work more closely alongside other programmes, violence against women and girls, issues that affect queer communities, issues that affect those with disabilities. People sit across those, no one exists in one single characteristic. And I think that policing needs to get to grips with that, which is a difficult thing to do, but until it does and approaches it on that systemic level, it's not going to change anything.
Okay. We have got some questions coming in, so I'm going to put these to you, panel, if that's all right, and I'll come back to you with some specifics as well. The first question is, how would the panel advise policing to reconcile the clear differences in views of some chief officers and the Home Secretary and staff support networks regarding the anti-woke agenda, more specifically in the LGBTQ plus space? I think for this one, Vanessa, can we go to you, please? I mean, for instance, would you march in Pride next year?
I do march in Pride. I have marched in Pride, and I will continue to march in Pride, just as a sort of opening.
Right.
I constantly ask myself what this anti-woke means. I genuinely don't know what it means. This sort of description, this title that we seem to have been given, policing being anti-woke. Of course, there'll be definitions around it, but I don't recognise it. I think it's really important that we remember, we've got the title up here about being an inclusive culture, about what this is all about. And we are all here because we are passionate and because we get up every single day to protect communities, to keep people safe and to prevent crime. And if we have an inclusive culture, we allow people to be the best police officers, the best police staff that they can be to support that, because that's what this is all about keeping people safe and protecting people from harm. And I think it gets lost along the way sometimes in getting focused on what is anti-woke. We're doing this for this reason here. That would be what I would say. In terms of differences between the sort of parties that you've described there, I think we have to be very clear and very focused on this and not be distracted by external influences. As I say, we're here for those reasons I've described, and that's what we must remain focused on. And certainly the chief constables that I know and that I talk to are also very focused on this.
Okay, you raised a point that you didn't know what anti-woke is. I know we've got the professor here. I wonder, could you explain to us, in layman's terms, what is anti-woke in 2023?
I should probably out myself from the start as a fully paid up member of the tofu-eating, Guardian-reading wokerati. And oddly enough, I agree with Suella Braverman and the Daily Mail that there's a woke agenda. It's a very simple agenda. It's treat people with kindness and empathy.
Okay, as simple as that?
As simple as that.
Okay. I wonder, does anybody not understand that clearly or agree with it or see it having a place here in what we're talking about? No? Okay.
The problem is anti-woke, when somebody like Suella Braverman says it, means a completely different thing to the actual meaning of woke. Being woke means alert to injustice, and it's terminology that came from African American culture, and specifically it meant racial injustice. Suella Braverman and the others who sit on her side of the political spectrum and have their agenda use it to describe anything that they disagree with, and whether that means that they are effectively undermining the reality of the experiences of people who live through injustice that actively harms them, they do not care. And so when you're having a conversation with somebody and you're using a word and they're using it in a different way with a specific agenda, they are being actively dishonest in that conversation. And that's the difficulty. No one's getting anywhere because she's lying about what it means. She's using her very, very powerful platform to undermine things that she could be instead using to assist, and it then enables others who sit in leadership positions within policing, within other organisations, to legitimise their racism and their discrimination and other forms of prejudice. So the question that was being asked was, in the current climate that we're in, with the Home Secretary that we have, with police leadership not being unanimous, without these inspections and so on, how can we actually get any of this done? The truth is we won't. I say it quite clearly in the introduction to our annual report. With this current Home Secretary, with the rhetoric that she is using, with the distraction techniques that she uses around these matters and her kind of scattergun approach to terminology like woke, she will actively undermine the progress of these matters. And that's why the action points which were highlighted by the leadership in the PSA are really important. That's why if you are somebody who is in any sort of leadership position and you can see that that's what's happening and you agree with it, but you don't speak openly about it, you're allowing that to persist. you're allowing that to continue to exhibit that harm. And so this is not a time, we're not in a time now where you can be a passive bystander, because if you do so, you're allowing that to fester and you're allowing that to gain traction and to continue.
Okay, thank you. I know, Neil, you want to add to that, don't you?
Very briefly, I know these terms are all very divisive. So before I retired, I had this great sobriquet in the right-wing press of being the super woke so-called head of counter-terrorism. So I'd just like to say, if you want to make a culture war out of an issue of woke, which, as Abby says, comes from people standing up for their civil rights and being alert to the fact that there was injustice in society, if you want to deflect 13 years of harm to policing and public services that have made your life incredibly difficult, what a brilliant thing to deflect criticism by starting this kind of cultural war over this issue. And I think that's precisely what's happening, because if I've got that, I'm really proud of that title, by the way. I was really hurt by so-called head of counter-terrorism, but I particularly like being called super woke because I am. And I think you all should be too. So this is my challenge to you as a room full of incredibly powerful police officers. If you don't believe in racial and social justice, you should not have a badge. Your job is to police 100% of the public, not just the people you like. You know, the idea that we don't fight for justice seems a bit odd, given that I once had a badge and you've still got one. Isn't fighting for justice exactly what we're all about? So don't listen to a Home Secretary who seems to think that effective police officers are only those who don't concentrate on injustice in society, but are just crime fighters, as another Home Secretary once said. That is absolute nonsense. And I'm very proud of the fact that I've been woke my entire life. And I will put my track record of arresting gangsters and terrorists up against any anti-woke police officer.
Okay, thank you. We are talking about inclusive culture, and specifically the police culture. And I wonder, Professor, if you could explain to us why it is difficult to address police culture, because I know you have a theory about this, don't you?
Yeah, I'm going to be a typical academic and start somewhere else, but I'll get there.
No, that's
I promise. Fine. Yeah. Earlier in my career, I did a lot of research in investment banks, and I've come to notice a remarkable similarity in one regard between policing and investment banks. It's not what you're paid, by the way. But if I tell you that in the lead up to 2007, 2008 financial crisis, all of these exotic financial products are being traded around subprime mortgages. Any banker knows there's a very strong relationship between risk and profit. And so they were making extraordinary profits on these things. But apparently nobody found the time to ask themselves, what are the extraordinary risks that we must be carrying in order to make these extraordinary profits? Those risks became apparent once the world economy collapsed. And any organisation will have a degree of uncomfortable knowledge around. All organisations have narratives about who they are and what they do. And knowledge and information that contradicts those narratives is uncomfortable knowledge. And different kinds of strategies get used to avoid that uncomfortable knowledge. Denial, just straightforward denial, it's happening. There is no racism in my force. Actually, I know from a discussion with a couple of senior women police officers that in a discussion about uncomfortable knowledge, they told me that when the Casey report came out, their chief officer had said to them, this doesn't apply to our force, it's just the Met. As one of them said to me, she said, nobody was asking us women about our experiences of misogyny in this force. So straightforward denial sometimes. Dismissal is accepting there's some information there but denigrating it in some way. So what are good ways of denigrating it? Well, woke's one. Another way is dealing with the tendency that we all have to pay attention to things that are more that arouse our emotions. Our emotions govern what we pay attention to. So how do you avoid people paying attention to something? You find ways of downplaying the emotional content. A very interesting phrase in some of the interviews that are in the Casey report around some units where there were problems of retention, officers, it being accepted that these officers would colour outside the lines. When you use euphemisms like that, it's often a real signal that there's some uncomfortable knowledge that's being hidden away. Because after all, if instead of saying that, they'd said officers were being allowed to get away with egregious breaches of professional standards, it would have had a much bigger emotional impact. Even the use of some acronyms can act in that kind of way. I worry actually about the tendency to use an acronym for violence against women and girls, because when you say VORG, it has a lot less emotional impact. So other ways of avoiding uncomfortable knowledge, well, one is distraction. You know, pointing things in a different direction. Here's a quote that someone gave me. Yes, I'm sure this is all very important, but I've got frontline operations to run, and I can't afford the level of distraction this would require. And I think actually, perhaps one of the most important pieces of uncomfortable knowledge facing policing at the moment is the level of change that's required to restore public legitimacy, and I'm not sure I'm happy talking about trust. I think trustworthiness is the right phrase. Then that actually means that you can't do it without some impact on operational capability, because you've got to be willing to abstract people from frontline duties. You've got to be willing to prioritise resources into doing something about these serious problems. So that's something that's got to be grappled with. And a good example, by the way, of diversion, which is putting your energies into something that might apparently seem to solve the problem, is what in the Casey report they reported as initiativitis. Lots and lots of short-term initiatives to tackle problems that didn't last very long and had no real impact. Yeah. You see this a lot in organisations all across the country, actually, around diversity issues, where there's a whole industry out there devoted to producing courses. Those courses typically take about 20 minutes to half an hour to do online, finish with a quiz, and that's your diversity training ticked off as long as you pass the quiz. There's absolutely no evidence that they have any impact whatsoever, but the organisation can kind of say they're doing something. So I think that one of the things that policing has to grapple with is how to recognise the areas of uncomfortable knowledge and how to start tackling them. And I'll just give you one example that comes to some extent out of some research that we've done around new recruits training in stations. I've talked to lots of senior officers who've told me that the Uplift programme represents a once-in-a-generation opportunity for culture change, with really inducting people into the right kinds of values and also, to some extent, benefiting from the fact that the young people coming into the force think in different kinds of ways. I've also talked to people who've told me that in order to avoid abstraction, the tendency is to use people for training who are confined to desk duties, and that somebody who's got a bad leg, a very experienced officer, maybe that's fine. But some of those anecdotal stories I've heard from officers concern people who are currently under investigation for a grievance, in one case for serious sexual harassment. So any organisation faces this tension between strategic change and getting the operations right. It's always there for any organisation. In our research on senior police leadership in two police forces during the pandemic, we observed that, operationally, the police had done a really, really good job of managing the pandemic. And some of that was around the approach to strategic command. But actually, if we think about it, strategic command isn't strategic. Actually, for policing, it's part of the day job. It's operational. And a number of chief officers actually have told me that they think that policing is not that great at strategy, what they also referred to as slow time decision making. And I think what I've noticed in the time, I'm not a policing insider, but one of the things I've noticed as an outsider is the almost sacred nature of avoiding abstraction and the sacred nature of a primary focus on operations. Well, if you're always focused on the operations and you're not putting resources into what the force is going to look like in the medium and long term, you're never going to make successful change.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to get through some of these questions. How would the panel implement the Casey report, specifically in relation to highly specialised units such as firearms? Who would like to take that? Neil? Yeah? Yeah, of course. How would the panel implement the Casey report, specifically in relation to highly specialised units such as firearms? Neil? Yep.
Well, that's an incredibly difficult one for me because I used to run them. So when I read Louise's report, I'm a friend of Louise, I'll put that on the table to start with, so I was both interviewed for her report, I was a member of the management board that was castigated by the report. I'm effectively the overall operational commander of some of the units that are taken apart in that report, and was once head of armed policing as well, so 19 which was taken out in that report. And I also So I ended up feeling like a victim and a perpetrator of the Louise Casey report. And when I looked at if you think about where Cousins and Carrick came from, and I don't talk about them publicly, because just like terrorists, we shouldn't give them any kind of sense that they've got any notoriety or any kind of agency at all. When I look about the culture that they came from, so Cousins specifically from a military policing background, effectively a sentry who was given a year's induction in the Metropolitan Police and how territorial policing works. But Carrick being in some ways more disturbing because he was inculcated with a normal police officer's career and therefore would have had an opportunity to be what I would call somebody who does engage with the public. So those firearms commands are difficult because they are full of incredibly specialist, incredibly elitist people. And I've managed every elite unit in the Metropolitan Police, from terrorism to firearms to serious and organised crime. So I know that what comes with that sense of elitism is a sense of separatism, that you are somehow special, you are somehow entitled. I often describe it as, a lot of police officers have that view. We like to think we're all Peel and we are the public and the public are the police. I'm not sure we ever got that absolutely right. We feel more police than public. And if you're in a very specialised and elite part of policing, you definitely feel different and entitled. And that's got to be challenged. That has got to be challenged, largely through more routine. Paul Condon tried this back in the 90s. He tried it with tenure, trying to rotate people out of those specialisms and back into core policing and give people a flavour of what actually they should be doing alongside the public. That would be a very difficult thing to do because of exactly what the professor has said. The abstraction and the cost in training people to that elite level means when you put them back into core policing, there is a problem there. But actually, that is a leadership problem that has to be tackled, because it is generating people who are very safe and secure in the knowledge that they are very special. And that was my experience of leading those teams. So I'll say this with no degree of pride, and in fact a great deal of shame, is in parliamentary and diplomatic protection, I was responsible for amalgamating diplomatic protection and parliamentary protection. I was responsible for managing that unit both as DAXO and then later on as EXO. I put in 3 different management teams and some of the best leaders, including some of your members, that Metropolitan Policing had to offer, and they made almost no difference. When I retired, I haven't told Mark this, but I would recommend if I was in front of any parliamentary committee that parliamentary and diplomatic protection should no longer be a policing responsibility. It is not a police function. It is a function that's performed by the military quite successfully at lots of critical national infrastructure. It doesn't require a policing mentality. And I, in my entire service, including when I was head of armed policing, I had not found a person in those roles who was proud of what they did. They were doing it for the money and for the fact that they weren't having to face the extraordinary pain, emotional and physical effort of being a response police officer or a main office detective. Their life, they knew, was easier, it was better rewarded, and that was the first answer every single time, from commander to deputy assistant commissioner to assistant commissioner, that I got. And I had the worst. One of their inspectors once invited me to sit on a panel like this on my own with his team, and I said, don't force people to come, make it voluntary, and not a single person showed up. Now, I'm not an egomaniac. I don't necessarily think that you should respect somebody because of their rank. I just thought it was a very telling thing. It's never happened to me before or since in 30 years service, that nobody could be bothered to turn up and tell me what they thought about their policing position. So I think those units, specialist, elite, set apart, that culture needs to change. You can't stay on it too long. And I could not understand why you wouldn't be proud of protecting the mother of all parliaments or our diplomatic community, which gives Britain great influence worldwide. Why couldn't you be as proud of that as a neighbourhood police officer is bringing safety to their community? It is not the first answer you get. It's incredibly disappointing. I don't know what Mark's going to do with it and with that report, but it does need something radical, as Louise Casey said.
We'll ask him tomorrow, hopefully. Thank you very much. I won't ask any of the other panel members on that question because we've got a few that I want to get through. This one perhaps we could take. Police Scotland is coming to terms with the backlash from Sir Ian Livingstone's public statement in May that our organisation was institutionally discriminatory across all protected characteristics. Was this the right thing to do? Do you want to take this, Vanessa, first?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was an interesting statement because we were at Chiefs Council a day or two before that and felt that Chiefs, needed to be consistent because we're talking about policing as a whole, and we weren't aware that that statement was going to be made. Not that we had to be, but among Chief Constables, I think it was a thing that it would have been something to understand together, understand the rationale, and I don't think it was particularly helpful when it came out, and I don't think that it benefited policing in any way, and the question clearly says that now Police Scotland is sort of trying to recover, whatever the words were used around it, and I think that's a fair enough statement.
Okay, Abby, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think that I think admitting institutional racism is a very key step in order to deal with any of those problems. Admitting institutional levels of discrimination is very important. But I also think the way that you make the admission is extremely, extremely important. And I think that one of the issues that we see is that there's a pattern in terms of the leaders in policing who make those admissions. It tends to be those who've already retired, those who are towards the end of their careers, those who do it in a kind of reactionary position. And rarely have we seen examples of people bringing the force along with them when they do so. So what happens is you have somebody who is in an influential position or was in an influential position who makes this admission and either has no power to change the institution afterwards or will not be sticking around to change the institution afterwards. And I think what would be much more powerful would be to see people who have had those conversations, challenging conversations internally, who've brought along very key organisations like their local police federation, because the pattern that we often see, again it's in our report, is a senior leader makes an admission around institutional racism, that's what I'm concentrating on, but there's been admissions of institutional other types of discrimination. And then very often the local police fed chair will come out with a statement that says, that's rubbish, my officers are not individually racist, etc., and then it becomes that distraction where it's a debate around what institutional racism means rather than people concentrating, getting together and dealing with the actual racism itself. So I think those admissions are very important. I think the way that they are done is even more important, which is you ready your force and you ready your community, and then you come out with an admission that demonstrates the influence of both and demonstrates the fact that you are a key leader who is then going to follow through with dealing with the manifestations of institutional racism. And there are some leaders who I think are closer to that. So Chief of Avon in Somerset recently did that and was able to evidence all like the swathe of conversations that she had had, but you still saw her police fed chair coming out with a very obstructive statement almost immediately afterwards. So I think for me, a positive sign will be when I see a police leader say that and I see evidence of those conversations having been done internally and members of community sitting alongside them, and then you see a clear plan as to how they are going to make those changes last moving forward. So it's not just going to change and reset because you get a different police and crime commissioner or a different chief constable or a different fed chair. It has to mark an institutional change in order for it to mean something. Yeah,
and that change has to happen. I know you both put your hand up. Yeah, if you can, very quickly, because we've got a couple of questions, and I do want to bring Tracy back in as well.
I just want to say that I think that word institutional is really important, because it's one thing to say we're a force that's got people who are racist in it. It's another thing to say that we have organisational conditions that conspire to make it difficult for us to recruit the right kinds of people and promote the right kinds of people.
Protect people from those communities.
Exactly. And I think that avoiding that conversation about the institutional characteristics of a force that are leading to the wrong kinds of outcomes it means it's unlikely that things will be sufficiently tackled.
Okay. I've got just under 5 minutes, so this question's to all of you, actually. Given the lived experiences of colleagues that we've just heard, both your own and obviously the panel before, are you in despair for the future, or is there some hope? Tracy, can we start with you, please?
Yes, that's a massive question. Yes, I do have hope for the future because of the conversations that we're having now, the fact that we've got a room full of senior leaders. One of the things I had on my list about change and how can we make things better is when senior leaders stand up to be counted. They talk about their own personal stories, their own difference. It's sad to see that when making the videos there weren't that many volunteers or people were worried about the impact it would have on their career to be their authentic self at work. So, yeah, I am hopeful for the future because we're having those conversations. It is slow, but we are going in the right direction. I've got nearly 30 years service myself, and I have a number of protected characteristics, and I think it's great that we have a full representation across the board here. But something I did want to say, because I think there are so many commonalities amongst us all, is that it seems to me, because when we're looking at things like even just something simple like a reasonable adjustment for somebody that has a disability, for some reason there seems to be an underlying pervasive culture of mistrust that that person is actually telling the truth when they're talking about their own difference. And if we go back to the video and see the reluctance of somebody to come forward, why would anybody want to claim they're disabled when they're not? And there's this feeling that actually they will gain an advantage. And what this suggests to me is it's not the fact that we need to work harder for the communities to gain the trust of the police. I think some of our senior leaders mistrust our communities, both internally and externally. And when they start to believe what we say is going on, then we can see some change.
That's an interesting point, isn't it? When you say mistrust the actual statement as well, that goes right to the core, doesn't it? And that perhaps touches on what you were saying. I think it was you, Neil, earlier on about the culture initially being very sort of focused on high performance and delivering that specifically. I just wondered, are you hopeful for the future? Because you've had probably most to say, I would say, that was probably very representative of what people were saying, but maybe some people feel they can't say that, but you obviously have said it today. So are you hopeful for the future? I'm going to ask all of you, but I'm looking at you, Neil.
Specifically,
yes, you first.
I like to think I was a reasonably good leader, and you can't be a leader unless you are optimistic and hopeful. You shouldn't really be given leadership positions. So my parents were stoned in the streets for holding hands in the 1960s. I was badly beaten in the 70s and 80s. My children have had an infinitely easier life than I have, and I had an infinitely easier life than my parents. I look at that as a trajectory of great hope. You know, the way we talk about diversity and inclusion and equity and equality of opportunity today is stratospherically different than I remember listening to as a child. The last 10 years, an aberration caused by Trump and Brexit and Johnson and his conservative clique. It's not about conservatism, it's about this particular character of politician. It's not about their political ideals. All of that has created a problem that I think is short-term. And I think the long-term trajectory is much more hopeful than that. And just on the point about chiefs coming out and saying it, I agree 100% with Abby. I'm going to be very defensive and say that I started saying it 3 years before I retired, not anticipating that I would be retired. My retirement was not entirely voluntary. So there is and if I had stood for Commissioner, I would have stood for it on a platform of diversity, equality and inclusion. This government knew that. I was described to me as having 0 out of 10 chance of getting that job and very little chance of getting the National Crime Agency. But I wasn't going to be bullied out of both jobs, so I applied for the National Crime Agency and that was taken away. That is the power of these people if you don't stand up to be counted for what you think is right. And I think this is a very powerful body. I'm going to say this, Paul, because Paul's heard me say it many times. This, for me, in my 30 years, was always the most sensible body of all three of us. This was the sensible body that came to sensible conclusions and understood what was happening in policing. And I think, as effectively the most senior of middle management, if you'll forgive that slightly patronising air, you have the most influence about what happens from the message from the top and what you're hearing from the bottom. And unless you adopt the same approach to DEI, I will have less hope. That's the reason I'm here today.
I'm beginning to regret the fact we're over time now, because we could ask you so much more, couldn't we? But sadly we are. I just very quickly want a closing statement from all of you, if that's okay. Just a couple of sentences. I know we talked about you being hopeful potentially for the long-term future, but immediately, the short-term future, what do you want to see happen? Vanessa, can we start with you?
Yeah, I'll be very brief. So some of the things that have gone on recently, I was speaking to a colleague of mine and I was asking what a colleague who's no longer with us, Julie Barnes-Frank, would have thought about this, who was a wonderful advocate, particularly in GMP, but nationally as well around, particularly LGBT staff support networks, about what is happening at the moment and you know, what her approach would have been. And I think her words are what I feel at the moment and what we must do. And she said she would have been incensed, first of all, about what's happening, but then she would have been resolutely focused, determined, and would have brought everyone together to continue this. And that's what I feel that we all need to do as senior leaders in policing.
Great, thank you. Tracy.
Just engage with your staff networks, both nationally and locally. Give them the time, the resources they need to do the job, release them to do the job, and put your money where your mouth is.
Thank you. Professor?
Reasons for hopefulness. There's an awful lot of good people in policing. Reasons for pessimism. I'm not sure that policing organisationally has got to grips with the scale of the work that needs to be done.
Okay. Cautionary note there. Abby.
I mean, similar to Mark, I'm hopeful because I'll have a specific conversation with somebody and then feel rejuvenated and think, actually, this could be done, because there are some amazing people who, despite everything that you see that goes so badly in policing, are some of the bravest, hardest working and most dedicated people that I've seen. On the other hand, I think exactly what you said again, Mark. I think policing is a really reactionary institution and that you spend a lot of time firefighting. And so I think the most powerful thing that you can do as you move into your leadership positions is giving people the time to contemplate, reflect, and actually action the things that you want them to do. And actually that can mean protecting them, batting away other responsibilities, standing up for them, standing behind them, leading from behind, and so on. Those are really powerful steps to take to embody organisational change within a structure that doesn't allow people to have any breathing space to deliver on anything except for what's right in front of them. So I think that's a really key way that you guys in your leadership positions can make a change to your organisation.
Great, thank you. Neil, last word to you.
Don't let this be the last conversation you have on this subject. It is not a tick box exercise like all of those diversity training packages. It is amazing that you're having this conversation. Keep it going. Double down on what Abby said. You know, the problem in 1999, there was no strategic communications plan about institutional racism. In 2023, there was no strategic communications plan. You know, Vanessa is exactly right. It was divisive because nobody thought about engaging your frontline, your communities, and the various staff associations on the issue before they came out and said it. It seems unbelievable that we were able to repeat a mistake that we absolutely crucified us 30 years ago, but we absolutely did it. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't start talking about it and be brave. And when I say be brave is, there is nothing braver than doing a U-turn on a bad policy decision.
Great. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please thank our panel? Thank you very much. Thank you.